Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal interesting facts on Tuesday, July 22, 2025. First, Laura had faced countless storms in her life, but nothing could have prepared her for the wave of confusion and dread that washed over her when she received Anna's confidential report. The moment she saw Jocelyn's name linked with the WSB, her breath caught in her throat. For years, Laura had regarded the WSB with wary respect. A ghostly empire of espionage where trust was a liability and loyalty often led to ruin. The notion that someone as young, vibrant, and spirited as Jocelyn Jacks had found herself entangled in such a perilous organization was not just baffling, it was deeply unsettling. Jocelyn, whom she remembered as Carly's outspoken daughter, a fierce protector of her loved ones and a girl full of conviction, now stood at the edge of a moral abyss, and no one could explain how or why. Laura could not simply dismiss the information. The report from Anna was clear, precise, and chilling. It suggested not only that Jocelyn had joined the WSB but that her induction had not followed the usual vetting processes. Something about it felt rushed, cloaked in secrecy. There were whispers of Brennan's direct involvement, Brennan, a man whose name alone carried the weight of betrayal and manipulation. Laura's mind flashed to the missions Brennan had orchestrated in the past. Missions that left nothing but destruction and regret in their wake. If Jocelyn had indeed become one of his assets, it was not out of honor or patriotism. It was part of a deeper, more nefarious game. And Laura feared Jocelyn, in her youthful determination to make a difference, had no idea she was just a pawn. The more Laura dug, the more the pieces refused to align. There was no formal record of Jocelyn's training, no indication she had gone through the same rigorous psychological evaluations that most recruits endured. Instead, there were holes, redacted documents, and timelines that didn't make sense. It was as if someone had gone through great lengths to erase the truth and replace it with a polished illusion. That only deepened Laura's worry. Because in her experience, when the WSB began to hide their tracks, it meant something terrible was being set into motion. It wasn't just that Jocelyn had joined a dangerous organization. It was that she might already be in over her head, used for a mission she didn't fully understand, and surrounded by people who saw her not as a person but as leverage. Laura's instincts as a mother, a leader, and a survivor kicked in. She couldn't afford to sit back and let this spiral beyond control. Port Charles had always been a battleground of secrets, but this felt different. It was personal. Carly had the right to know, but Laura hesitated. What would it do to her if she found out her daughter had been swallowed by the same darkness that once consumed so many lives? But perhaps even more frightening was the thought that Carly already knew, and had kept silent to protect Jocelyn's choices. That silence, if true, was as dangerous as any enemy. Laura couldn't bear the thought of another child, another legacy, being sacrificed to an organization that didn't care about the wreckage it left behind. And so she began to plan. Her first move was to confront Anna again, this time not as an old friend but as an ally with shared concern. Together, they combed through older files, connections, and possible ties between Brennan and any individuals in Port Charles. One thing became clear. Brennan had been operating in the shadows far longer than anyone suspected. There were surveillance records, coded transmissions, even intercepted communications that suggested he had been watching Jocelyn for months, maybe years. It chilled Laura to the bone to realize that this might not have been Jocelyn's choice at all. Coercion, manipulation, emotional blackmail, these were Brennan's weapons. And if he had used them on a vulnerable young woman searching for purpose, then Laura vowed he would pay dearly. But time was slipping away. Every hour Jocelyn remained under WSB's influence, the more likely she would be drawn deeper into a web of control, indoctrination, and violence. Laura began tracking leads. Names whispered in quiet corners of Port Charles, past operatives who might still hold grudges or memories, anyone who could confirm Jocelyn's location or status within the organization. Her days blurred into nights, her mind haunted by possibilities. What if Jocelyn had already been sent on a mission? What if Brennan had plans to use her against her own mother, her own town. What if this was about revenge? Brennan didn't just operate for power. He thrived on personal vendettas, and Laura feared Carly's past might now be catching up with her daughter. In a town riddled with secrets and shifting allegiances, Laura found herself walking a delicate line between hope and fear. She refused to believe Jocelyn was lost, but she also knew time was the one luxury she couldn't afford to waste. Her love for Port Charles had always been fierce, but this time it was different. This time it was about protecting a future that was being rewritten without consent. And so, even as the shadows of the WSB grew longer and more threatening, Laura prepared herself for war, not one waged with weapons, but with conviction, truth, and the unwavering resolve of a woman who refused to let another innocent soul be consumed by the same darkness she had spent her life fighting against. Second, when Portia's world began to crumble beneath the weight of her own choices, it was Isaiah who remained quietly constant, a steady presence in the eye of a storm she had unwittingly unleashed. Despite her composed exterior, Portia was breaking apart inside, haunted by the irreversible consequences of her decision to manipulate Michael's test results. What had begun as a misguided attempt to protect her family or shield someone from deeper pain had now spiraled into a devastating revelation. Michael had been wrongly diagnosed, unjustly labeled, and pushed toward a path of psychological and social ruin. The lie was no longer something she could contain. Each moment she stayed silent, the guilt ate away at her integrity and her sense of self. She was a doctor, a healer, a protector. But now she had become the architect of a falsehood that could destroy lives. Isaiah had seen it all in her eyes before she ever said a word. He knew the language of shame, of silent panic, and of hearts unraveling under the pressure of secrets. He never demanded an explanation. He didn't need one. Instead, he offered something far more powerful, quiet reassurance, gentle reminders that no one was beyond redemption, and that sometimes, the bravest act wasn't to keep pretending, but to confront the consequences head-on. But Portia was terrified. The hospital board, the licensing authorities, the criminal justice system, they would not be kind. More than her career, she feared for her family's name, her daughter's respect, and Curtis's trust. Every lie she had told seemed now like a loaded weapon pointed back at her. Even so, she could no longer live with herself. Portia began to prepare for the fallout, fully intent on confessing everything. But Curtis, despite his disappointment and confusion, couldn't bear to watch his wife walk willingly into destruction. His instinct wasn't judgment, it was protection. He had spent too long fighting for the chance at happiness, too long watching his life spiral from tragedy to recovery. He wasn't ready to lose the woman he loved to a system that wouldn't care about the intentions behind her crime. Curtis understood what Portia had done was wrong. But he also saw the woman behind the mistake. A woman crushed by remorse, a woman desperate to fix what she had broken. So Curtis began making plans, covert conversations with lawyers, discreet inquiries about safe jurisdictions, allies he could trust to keep things quiet. His loyalty to Portia never wavered, but the clarity in his eyes sharpened. He knew that helping her escape wouldn't erase the truth, but it might buy them time. Time to correct the narrative. Time to rebuild trust. Time to understand how everything had gone so terribly wrong. He reminded Portia that she wasn't alone, that running didn't mean cowardice, it meant surviving long enough to make things right in a way the world wouldn't allow if she stood exposed and vulnerable. Meanwhile, Isaiah worked in the background, guiding Portia emotionally through each tremor of anxiety. He became the voice she listened to in the silence, the calm when her hands trembled and her breath became shallow. He reminded her that self-forgiveness wasn't weakness, and that even in darkness, light could be found in truth, just not always at the mercy of unforgiving systems. Isaiah knew Curtis's plan wasn't perfect, but he didn't fight it. He understood there were no perfect solutions, only desperate ones born from a place of love. Portia's collapse had been triggered by one lie, but her healing would require something even more dangerous, the courage to keep going in the face of endless uncertainty. Portia often found herself staring out the window at dusk, wondering when her life had become so complicated. Her reflection reminded her of the vows she had taken, to do no harm, to stand for what was right. Yet here she was, on the verge of fleeing the very community she had vowed to serve. Every moment she stayed was a risk. Every step toward confession felt like walking into a guillotine. But each time she hesitated, she thought of Michael, of the truth she owed him, and of the redemption she still longed to earn. If she left, it would not be forever. It would be to buy the chance to return stronger, more honest, and more whole. Together, Porsche, Curtis, and Isaiah now moved like shadows, each with their own role to play in a fragile plan. Nothing was guaranteed. But one thing had become clear. Porsche's world had changed forever, and no matter what came next, she would never again be the same woman who had believed a single alteration in a lab result could stay hidden forever. The truth always surfaced. But sometimes, it needed help finding the light. Third, the announcement from Sidwell sent shockwaves through the heart of Port Charles, a town already burdened with secrets, fractured loyalties, and the ever-present undercurrent of unresolved vendettas. It wasn't just a press statement, it was a detonation. Standing before a sea of reporters, cameras flashing and tension rising, Sidwell publicly accused Sonny of being the one who orchestrated the poisoning of Natalia, a charge that instantly plunged the Corinthos' name into scandal. The timing was deliberate, the wording precise, and the ramifications immediate. For decades, Sonny had lived in the gray space between hero and criminal, protector and predator, but this was different. This time, he wasn't being whispered about in back rooms, he was being condemned on record. The people of Port Charles watched in stunned silence as their once untouchable icon was branded a murderer in the public eye. The impact on the community was swift and polarizing. For those who had long distrusted Sonny, Sidwell's declaration was a vindication of their suspicions. They saw it as justice finally catching up to a man who had spent years manipulating the legal system, silencing enemies, and walking free while others paid the price. But for Sonny's supporters, those who had stood by him through wars, betrayals, and loss, it was a betrayal of the highest order. They knew he had enemies, and Sidwell, with his polished charm and political ambitions, now emerged as a dangerous rival capable of dismantling everything Sonny had built. Businesses shuttered early. Conversations in Kelly's diner grew hushed and tense. Even the hospital halls weren't spared the ripple effect, as staff whispered about what might come next. Amid the fallout, one figure seemed more rattled than most, Lucas. For weeks, he had harbored doubts, sensing inconsistencies in the medical data surrounding Natalia's collapse. As a doctor, his instincts had been nagging at him. Something in the tox screen hadn't aligned with the symptoms, and the sudden insistence on burying Natalia quickly had raised further alarms. But what disturbed Lucas more was the way certain files had mysteriously vanished from the hospital system, as if someone had gone in and deleted evidence. When Sidwell made his announcement, it didn't just confirm Lucas's worst fears, it gave them a name. Sonny. But Lucas wasn't ready to condemn blindly. He had known Sonny as a flawed man, yes, but also as someone who loved fiercely, protected his family, and carried burdens few could endure. Still, the medical anomalies wouldn't leave his mind. If Sonny had poisoned Natalia, it had to be for a reason, and if he hadn't, then someone was orchestrating an even darker deception. Either way, Lucas felt the obligation to find out the truth. He began digging through old reports, cross-referencing Natalia's treatment records, and asking quiet questions no one wanted to hear. Each step confirmed that this was bigger than one public accusation, it was a tangled conspiracy, and someone wanted Sonny to burn. Curtis and Anna, watching the chaos from behind the scenes, began to reassess everything they thought they knew. Sidwell's motives weren't just political, they were personal. Natalia's death had triggered something, and now the chessboard was shifting with ruthless precision. Curtis suspected that Sidwell had allies buried deep in the institutions of Port Charles, perhaps even inside the hospital or law enforcement. Meanwhile, Anna began suspecting that this wasn't just about revenge, it was a strategic takedown meant to expose Sonny's weakest points, his image, his power, and the loyalty of those who surrounded him. And in that unraveling, the real killer could remain invisible. As days passed, protests began forming outside Sonny's establishments. Former allies kept their distance. The police reopened files they had once closed. But Sonny didn't run. He stood defiant, even as the noose tightened around his name. Yet behind the silence of his eyes lay a growing concern: if he didn't poison Natalia, then who did? And more importantly, who stood to gain the most from watching his world implode? The weight of betrayal pressed heavily on his shoulders, but so did the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was using Natalia's death as a catalyst for an even greater power shift. And until the truth was uncovered, everyone in Port Charles remained at risk, because if they could bring down Sonny Corinthos, no one was safe. Finally, Martin had always understood the subtle currents of power that ran beneath the surface of Port Charles, the unspoken debts and invisible alliances that determined who thrived and who fell. So when he approached Tracy that afternoon, it wasn't with casual curiosity, it was with a growing sense of unease. Tracy had never been one to shy away from using leverage, but this time, she was playing with fire. He had overheard just enough to know that she was pressing Nina to confess her hidden relationship with Drew, a connection that had been carefully buried beneath layers of secrecy for good reason. To Tracy, it was another calculated move, another opportunity to destabilize her rivals and shift the balance of control. But to Martin, it was a dangerous provocation, one that could unravel more than just personal reputations. He knew the players involved. He knew the secrets were more volatile than anyone realized. Tracy, of course, was unmoved by Martin's concern at first. She had always trusted her instincts, and when she saw a weakness in someone, she struck with precision. She believed Nina's involvement with Drew was more than just a personal betrayal, it was a tactical deception, one that needed to be exposed to protect the legacy of those who had been misled. Tracy framed it as a matter of principle, but Martin saw through that. He had spent enough time in courtrooms and back rooms to recognize when someone was masking vengeance with virtue. What Tracy didn't realize, or perhaps didn't care to admit, was that forcing Nina's hand would do more than just embarrass her. It would ignite a scandal with tentacles that reached deep into ELQ, Crimson, and the undercurrent of power shifts already shaking the foundations of the city. Martin pleaded with her to reconsider, using every ounce of logic and legal foresight he could muster. He reminded Tracy that Drew's position in the business world was already precarious, especially after recent financial missteps that had quietly drawn scrutiny. Exposing his secret affair with Nina wouldn't just ruin him personally, it could destabilize corporate holdings, influence shareholder decisions, and even prompt an investigation into insider dealings. The implications were far-reaching, and Martin feared that the resulting chaos could engulf more than just the two people at the center of it. Port Charles had seen how personal vendettas often spilled into public disaster, and this had all the makings of one. More than that, Martin had come to respect Nina's attempts at redemption. She had made mistakes, terrible ones. But she was trying to rebuild, to form genuine bonds with Willow, with her grandchildren, and even, in some quiet way, with Carly. If Tracy pushed her now, the fallout wouldn't just be professional. It would be emotional, possibly catastrophic. Nina had kept her relationship with Drew private because she didn't want to feed the rumors, didn't want to give Carly more ammunition, and didn't want to complicate the already fragile relationships that surrounded her. Martin saw that as a rare moment of restraint from someone who had often let impulse guide her. And he believed she deserved the space to protect what little stability she had left. Still, Tracy remained unconvinced. Her loyalty was not to Nina or Drew, but to the institutions she saw as her legacy. ELQ had always been the battlefield where bloodlines and ambition collided, and she was determined not to let personal affairs corrupt its future. But Martin pushed harder, reminding her that exposing secrets without understanding their consequences was a dangerous game. He warned her that Drew, in particular, had powerful allies who might retaliate, not out of affection, but out of necessity. He also suggested that the move might make Tracy appear vindictive, petty even, in the eyes of the board, undermining her credibility when she needed it most. Martin's words began to chip away at her resolve. Not because she agreed with him, but because she trusted his judgment when it came to reading the long-term risks. He had been by her side during more than one legal disaster, had salvaged reputations and diffused tensions with a deftness she had come to rely on, even if she never admitted it out loud. If Martin was sounding the alarm, then the threat was real. Still, it wasn't easy for Tracy to back down. She saw secrets as tools, useful only when used. And the idea of letting Nina walk away unscathed felt like a missed opportunity. But Martin framed it differently. He asked her to consider that sometimes the most strategic move was not to act, but to wait. Let the truth come out naturally, without being weaponized. Let Nina and Drew expose themselves by their own missteps, rather than forcing a premature confession that could spiral into something uncontrollable. He knew Tracy hated inaction, but he urged her to consider the bigger picture. By holding back now, she preserved her influence and avoided being dragged into a scandal that could ultimately weaken her position.